My name's Craig Emmerich. We're going to talk about insulin, and it's probably not exactly what you're thinking. First, a little bit about me. I've had a long road with this disease that I have, this illness. You probably know me as much as anything as Maria's husband. Maria and I have written, I'm going to make this a little bigger so I can see it. There we go. Over 20 books. Even the early ones that just have her name on it, I was helping out in the background. I was doing nutritional info and doing meal plans and helping out. So we've worked together for over 20 years on keto carnivore diets and helping clients. And about 9 years ago, I started having this illness and issues. And long story short, I found out I had Lyme disease, so from a tick bite. That triggered chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, which you may hear from Judy and others at this conference. And that CIRS, which is like your immune system is just constantly fighting. It's in a fight mode constantly. And it starts to attack good cells. That's called an autoimmune reaction. And it started to attack good cells in me, and that's ankylosing spondylitis was the autoimmune reaction that I got from it. Tried everything over the years. I mean, you name it, I've tried it. Right now, the thing that works best for me, controlling my pain, is a carnivore diet and hyperbaric oxygen treatments. And if you know how to read is this the laser on here? No. If you know how to read I'm backwards, it's the next one. If you know how to read a image here, you can see my neck's all fused. Ankylosing spondylitis is kind of like arthritis of the spinal column and hips, and it calcifies over time, and so you get this calcification. It's basically just fused bone. So that's why I can't turn my head too much. But enough about me. Let's talk about everybody else. Consequences of obesity in America. So you've probably seen this before. This is the obesity map of the United States. Now, I want to note here, this is, BMI is not the perfect marker, but it's a marker. And with BMI, there's overweight, and then there's obese. This is obese category, okay? And you'll see it just keeps going up. Nobody ever goes down. And at the current state, 2021, the purple is 40 to 45% are obese in that state, okay? Not just overweight, obese. Here's another version of that map, okay? By county. This is county by county obesity rates. Look at this map. Kind of look like the same map, don't they? This other one is life expectancy. And note that the red, the darkest red, is 66 years, and the darkest blue is 86 years. That's a 20-year difference in average life expectancy. So this is a serious problem, and it's shortening people's lives. And I think all the myriad of diseases that come from obesity, you can correlate these two maps really well. This is where we're going if we don't do something about it. This is the projection in 2030. Half of America will be obese. It's a real problem, and we got to address it. And one of the ways we can address it is really understanding this little molecule here, this little protein molecule called insulin. So insulin, most people, when they think of insulin, they think of it's a storage hormone, right? Stores your glucose, stores off fuels, and that's part of the role of insulin. Especially when it comes to like glucose. Glucose really relies on insulin to be transported, stored or used in cells. But there's more to it, okay? There's a lot of different processes in the body, and it's always more complex than this kind of black and white, right? You say, oh, insulin storage hormone. Well, there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of other things that can store without insulin. And so here's a few examples. GLUT1 allows cells to use glucose without insulin. These are all these sources. I'm sure we can get slides after if you want to check all these studies out. They're all referenced and everything in here. Exercise also stimulates the cells to float blood close to the surface, and they can take it up glucose and fat without insulin, get close to the surface and they take them up. And there's even this study that showed that GLUT1 and other processes were responsible for up to 83% of glucose uptake. So there's more to it, right? So obviously, it's not just insulin that's doing this. And then there's fat. Fat is even more different when it comes to this in that it doesn't even really need insulin to be taken up in the fat cells. So your fat cells can take up fat without any elevation or really any action of insulin. We'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. And some of this misunderstanding about insulin kind of comes from this perspective here, which is a Petri dish example. And I know there's influencers and people in this space who will talk about this, where you take a Petri dish and you put adipose cells are the little fat storage cells in your body. That's where your body stores fat, is in your adipose tissue. If you put that in a Petri dish and you put some fat in there with it, nothing will happen until you put insulin in that dish. And then they'll take up the fat into the fat cells. But here's the thing. This is true. And what happens is researchers and people will look at that and say, okay, I have to elevate insulin to make it take up fat. So if I lower insulin, right? But that's not really the case. Humans always have some insulin around. In a Petri dish, you're going from no insulin, 0, to some, okay? In a human, you don't ever go from 0 insulin to some. You always have insulin around. Unless you're a type 1 diabetic who doesn't take any shots or exogenous insulin, you're never going to have a state where you go from none to some, okay? And so insulin is always there. And again, this fat storage pathway doesn't strictly require insulin's action. It just requires some insulin to be around for it to happen. So there's more to these things, and we're going to dive into this a little further to understand what insulin's real role in the body, at least what I'm proposing it to be. And that is, it's more of a fuel thermostat. So what's your thermostat in your house do? You set it at a temperature, and if the temperature in the room gets too high, it pulls it back down. If it gets too low, it pulls it back up. And it's constantly controlling the temperature of the room and keeping it in a tight range. Insulin is a lot the same as a thermostat, if you will, for the supply of energy in your blood. It's constantly controlling how much energy is in your blood for any given moment and any given need. And inhibits lipolysis. We'll get into a little more on lipolysis in a little bit, but lipolysis is basically the process of taking fat out of your fat cells to be used as fuel. That's lipolysis. Well, it kind of acts as a regulator of that. And in that way, if you look at the fat cells, it's as much as a net holding back fuel from coming out as it is storing fuels, okay? And this will become more obvious in a little bit when we get into it further. So basal insulin is much greater than transient insulin spikes. This study was done on type 1s, type 1 diabetics, so this paper. And what's great about that is type 1 diabetics don't make any insulin inside their body, right? And their pancreas doesn't make any insulin. And so you have to administer all the insulin they get throughout the day. And so you can know exactly how much insulin it takes to control their blood glucose, to control their day, right? You're administering it all. You can track it. These were people eating a low-carb diet. So again, if you're eating standard American diet, it's going to be a little different than this, more like maybe 50-50. But in a low-carb diet, about 80% of your daily insulin is for fasting insulin. When you're not eating anything, 80% of your insulin requirements for the day. In these type 1s, there's about 21 units of insulin for the whole day for just that basal insulin level. And then about 20% was for the meals. So when you ate food, insulin has to go up to utilize the fuel, whether it's carbs, protein. Protein is not really used as a fuel. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you still need insulin to utilize protein and build muscle with it. But insulin, at the end of the day, go back one. If eating low carb and fearing insulin rises with food, like you hear some people say, oh, don't do zero-calorie sweeteners, it'll raise your insulin. And some of these fears that are out there with respect to raising insulin, when you eat certain things, is really not that valuable in a low-carb context. Insulin, let's say you did Zevia. I like Zevia. It's sweetened with stevia, 0 calories, but it's got the sweetener in it. What if it did spike my insulin? You can't store fat you didn't eat. There's 0 calories in there's no fat in the soda. So even if insulin did go up, you can't store the fat if you didn't eat it, right? So fat doesn't affect insulin. Is this true? Let's dive a little bit deeper into this and start looking at the effects on different components. Some believe that fat has no effect on insulin. So this is where things like fat fasts and things come up, because they're like, oh, fat doesn't affect insulin, so you can just eat all you want and it'll never get stored. Well, first of all, and this is studies where they isolate, just give you a certain amount of carbohydrates, certain amount of fat, certain amount of protein, and look at the response. And while the insulin response is lower with fat, there's still a response. And it's plenty to store fat in your fat cells. And this was the type of fat used here. I can't remember what it is in the study, but even if you used another type of fat that didn't affect insulin at all, you can still store fat in your fat cells at basal insulin levels, that fasting insulin that's there all day long. The question is, let's say that was true, that you can't store fat without elevated insulin. Where does the fat go then? So your fat cells are where you want the fat stored, in your adipose tissue. That's where you want it. If it's not getting put into there, and then where's it going? Is it going to sit in the bloodstream and you got sky-high triglycerides? I don't think anybody wants that. Otherwise, it'll accumulate in your liver, pancreas, around your organs. Nobody wants that. It's got to go somewhere, and you want it to go into your fat cells. And there's also something called ASP, acylation stimulating protein, which can place fat into storage with 0 rise in insulin. So there's other mechanisms. Again, there's always more detail here than just, yep, that's a storage hormone. And then there's also an aspect of dietary fat that affects insulin kind of with a longer tail, okay? When you look at most of these studies, what they do is they looked at 1 hour or 2 hours post-meal to see how much insulin was required for that macronutrient, that fat, protein, or carbs. But if you look longer, over 12 or 24 hours, you'll see a different effect. And what they did in this study, again with type 1s, because they know exactly how much insulin is required here, identical protein and carbohydrate meals, they just changed the fat from 10 grams a day to 60 grams a day in the meals. What happened? Look at this bottom chart. The green line is the higher fat meal. This is the glucose response. The glucose goes up a little bit more, but look at the long tail, how it stays high longer, because you've got extra load on insulin and on the body for this extra fuel that's coming in, and it has to account for it and store it. And overall, when they did this entire test, 42% more insulin was required for the entire day for the meal with higher fat. So you might not see as much of it in the short term, but over the course of the day, it puts a higher overall load on insulin in your body. So let's talk a little deeper about this basal insulin versus postprandial insulin. Postprandial is post-meal, so after you eat, you get a transient, right? So that's what we're showing here. You get that spike after the meal, and then these are your basal or fasting insulin level. If you didn't eat anything, that's where it would sit all day long, right? So higher fasting insulin and very high insulin spikes from food are both bad things. And I'm going to posit here that the high fasting insulin is a much bigger problem than post-meal insulin. So let's look at these charts. So this example here, there's a person with real good metabolic function. They probably are not overweight because their fasting insulin in between meals here is like 2 or 3. So they got a really good fasting insulin, some spikes with food. This other person here fasting insulin of 20, and we see this all the time with clients. Fasting insulin is 20 or 30 or even 40. That person on the top there never has insulin below 20, okay? Let's say we ate nothing or ate some combination of food that created no spike in insulin after the meals, okay? That's what it's going to look like. That person on the top is still using a ton more insulin than this person down here, even if these spikes were really big, okay? That fasting insulin is a much bigger problem, and it's the reasons you'll see in a minute are what's driving the insulin resistance and the obesity. So it's a much bigger problem, and by far the best impact, if you want to lower your insulin load in your body, it's going to do much more impact to bring down your fasting insulin than it will be to bring down the post-meal insulin. It's going to have, back to, I have an electrical engineering background. If you go and you integrate under these curves to see how much there is here, this is going to be, orders of magnitude more insulin throughout the day. Biggest goal in reversing insulin resistance then should be to lower your fasting insulin levels. So a couple myths here. Low insulin means more fat will be burned. You probably have heard this many times. So does lowering your insulin mean that more fat will be released from your fat cells? First of all, if I could somehow inject you with something that made your insulin drop, yeah, there would be some weird effects that happened, and your body would not like it, because the pancreas, again, is control. It's the thermostat. It is doing its job. The pancreas doesn't make mistakes. It's not going to mistakenly lower insulin lower than it should be, as long as you're a healthy, non-insulin resistant kind of body. But if it did, let's say I injected you and it dropped, suddenly all this fat comes out, where does it go? Does it go, it's got, again, it can only either go back into your fat cells, it's called fat flux, we'll get it in a second, or it'll sit around in the blood and you got sky-high triglycerides. Or if the fat cells don't take it up, it's going to accumulate in other places like your organs and your liver, and fatty liver happens. You don't want that. It's got to be burned in the muscle. Otherwise, it goes right back into your fat stores. So fat flux, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's that cycle of fat in and out of the fat cells. Even with very high insulin levels, so again, back to this example, and we get this all the time, somebody with a fasting insulin of 20, they can still fuel their body. They're still getting fuel out of those fat cells. It's not like they're locked in there, right? They don't pass out. They don't go into a coma, right? Their cells are still getting fuel, even though their fasting insulin is very high. And so low insulin and weight loss, if lowering insulin makes it easier to lose weight, right, and this is what a lot of people in this keto carnivore community will say, and this is, everybody agrees on this, that as you lose body fat, that fasting insulin comes down, okay? So then, shouldn't the second 20 pounds be a lot easier to burn off than the first 20? Because insulin's going down. It's the opposite, the exact opposite. That first 20 pounds is the easiest. The next 20 is way harder. The next 20 after that is even harder than that. Yeah. And part of that is because as you lower insulin, you're becoming more insulin sensitive. Your fat cells, when you're in that state of very high basal insulin, it's because your fat cells are kind of stuffed. And they want to give up that fat. They're like, get rid of this. Get it, let it out. And so they let it out easy and fast in the beginning. As they shrink and they're like, okay, we're happy now, we can take up some more fat. So it'll take up fat easier. You're becoming more insulin sensitive. And it makes it harder to lose weight. So the opposite is true. And again, obese people with fasting insulin of 30 plus still can lose weight, and they lose weight pretty easily in the beginning when that fasting insulin is still 30. And one last myth, you can't store fat if insulin is low. Again, this kind of comes back to that Petri dish example, and humans are not Petri dishes. We don't ever go from no insulin to some. We always have that fasting basal insulin that's always there. And again, if you're not a type 1, you always will have insulin around. And again, what's the alternative? Nothing good. Sky-high triglycerides, fatty liver, etc. So a little more. Insulin is not the enemy, okay? You need it to use the fuels and use the protein that you're eating. Without insulin, you would die. You need it to store the fuels. You need it to create muscle and utilize that protein you're eating. So insulin's not the enemy. Small transients of insulin after eating, not a problem. That's normal, and that's the way the body works. Very large transients from standard American diet, huge carb meals, those can drive more hunger. We'll talk about that in a second. And that is a problem. But the fasting insulin is still an even bigger problem. So for your fat cells, insulin acts, again, sort of a thermostat, right? It's regulating the fuel, a net holding back all that fat in the storage so it doesn't flood in the bloodstream and cause all kinds of problems. And that's why obese people have very high fasting insulin, because the more fat you have on your body, the more insulin is required to hold it back. And so you get insulin keeps going up and up, that fasting insulin, so that it holds back all that fuel into storage. Chronic elevated fasting insulin, much bigger problem, in my view, than anything with meals. But you can get there by changing the meals. So it's a little, so how do you lower fasting insulin? Glad you asked. Let's talk a little bit about how the body processes fuels. So we're kind of breaking down the parts of the biochemistry of how the body works here. You think of an engine on a car. You don't want too much fuel going to that engine or you're going to blow it up. And so you have ways to regulate how much fuel is in the fuel lines. The thermostat is the regulator for the fuel in your bloodstream. The body does not like high fuels in the bloodstream. Too much fuel is going to be bad no matter what it is, whether it's really high alcohol, really high ketones, really high glucose, really high fat. These are all bad for the body. And so the body, the pancreas, its job is to control how much fuel's in that blood very tightly. And all of us right now, we're all sitting here, nobody's running a marathon or lifting weights. We got about 80 total calories. That's all the ketones, all the glucose, all the fatty acids, alcohol, if anybody's got some. The total is about 80 calories total in your entire blood volume. It's not that much. So think of that meal of 800 calories, all of a sudden you got that all flooding in. Body's got to get that taken care of. And one of the ways it does it is something called oxidative priority. It's where the body, basically in reverse order of storage capacity or reverse order of toxicity, you could really think of it as, it will prioritize these fuels to be burned. First is alcohol, because there's no storage space for alcohol, right? So, again, 80 calories at rest. If you have alcohol, so let's say we have this meal, and this meal is a couple beers, a cheeseburger, and french fries. So you had beer, so there's alcohol. The alcohol, the body has no place to store it. And guess what? Too much alcohol in the blood, you're dead. So the body's like, all right, we gotta burn this alcohol off, because I can't put it anywhere. And so it's burning the alcohol in your cells there, that's your mitochondria. And while that's happening, the majority of the carbohydrates in that meal are going to get stored into your liver and muscle. And if it runs out of room in the liver and muscle, it turns it to fat and puts it in your fat cells. The majority of the fat in that meal is also going to get stored into your fat cells, because it's got to deal with this alcohol that it can't store. Protein isn't really used as a fuel unless it has to be, meaning you don't have any carbs or fat around on the body or in the diet. So that primarily goes to building your muscle and whatnot. So the only fuels here, really, if we discount alcohol, is carbs and fat. Carbs and fat are our fuels. Protein is the amino acids, the building blocks for the body. And when you look at those two, so carbohydrates and fat, carbs displace fat being burned in the body. And so this is another reason why the low-carb lifestyle works so well for so many people. You'll see on this chart, this study, the hash line there is how much carbohydrate the body was oxidizing or burning. So how much of the fueling the body was carbohydrates. The white one is fat. And you'll see that in this let's see, circle it here. So if you're trying to lose weight, you must pick one of these fuels, right? Because these are the two fuels. But the problem is really high carbohydrates mean that you're going to have this cycle of hunger, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's why we keep carbohydrates to a minimum, like 20 grams or less. Prioritize protein for your size. So if you're 6 foot tall bodybuilder, you're going to need a lot more protein than a woman that's 5 foot tall, right? You have a lot more muscle to build, repair, and all that. And so you prioritize protein based on your lean mass, how much muscle you have, and that's how much protein you need. And that only leaves one variable, the fat. The fat you just adjust based on the goals. And to hammer home the point here a little bit, you see that the carbohydrates here, it was 120 grams, and then on the meal 3, the last one, it was 50 grams. So the carbohydrates, as they went down, you can see how much carbs were oxidized or burned by the body goes down, and how much fat goes up. So the carbohydrates is called the Randle cycle. The carbohydrates in the diet will just displace the fat from being burning. And again, that priority, they'll burn the carbs, store the fat. So there's another thing in this community that happens a lot, and that is that we start to fear normal glucose fluctuations. And so a lot of people, they get real, I don't want to spike my blood sugar and all this kind of stuff. And they start wearing CGMs, which are becoming more and more popular, right? And so people, we get this all the time, they kind of expect their CGM to look like that, right? Just this flat line, it never moves. That's not the real world. And you don't want it to be that way, okay? I would not be happy if my glucose was that flat. And the reason is there's a lot of things that will increase glucose. Things like eating protein, which I'm going to want to have enough protein to maintain my muscle. Exercise can really increase your blood glucose. Good stresses like sauna, cold therapy, they will greatly increase your blood glucose. Those are good things. And that's why we don't get, if you're eating low carb, don't really worry about what the CGM's saying. Just worry about your macros, getting your food right. And this is what can happen, and we've gotten multiple people that say this. I'm wearing my CGM, I did a workout, and my blood sugar skyrocketed. Now I'm not sure what to think of exercise. Exercise is good. I don't care what the CGM says. So now a couple more examples here of a good glucose spike. This one right here, that spike, the green dots are food. So this was, he woke up, did a fasted HIIT workout. Glucose went up by 100 points. That's the body, that's actually insulin going down to allow more fuel to dump out into the bloodstream to fuel the workout, right? And look at this one. This is CGM from the winner of the coast-to-coast race in New Zealand. Simone Mayer, she wore a CGM during this race. And you'll see the different phases here. There's a run, there's a bike, run, bike, kayak. It's all the way across New Zealand. She won the race, and you'll see her CGM here in that first bike section. It's actually flat on the top because it went to the max range on the CGM. Want to guess what glucose level that was? 480 milligrams per deciliter. Her body really needed some fuel, right? So again, normal glucose fluctuations with these kind of things, they're normal, and don't fear them. There are bad glucose spikes, right? We all know these from the standard American diet. Very high carb meals. What happens? Too much glucose in the bloodstream, again, is toxic. And so the body, especially when you're eating these refined carbohydrates and sugars that get into the bloodstream so fast, the pancreas is panicking. And it spikes insulin way high. And what's that do? Well, it drops that glucose very rapidly because, again, it's trying to keep you from dying. And then a lot of times it goes a little low as well because the body's just not used to this so much coming in so fast in the bloodstream. And that's why a falling blood sugar, and especially a low blood sugar, will cause hunger. And so what happens? You eat that 1,000-calorie flurry, right? 2 hours later, your blood sugar is crashing, and even though you just had 1,000 calories 2 hours ago, I could eat again. Or maybe even, man, I'm starving, because it's actually crashing, right? So this is the hormonal aspect of insulin spikes after food that are bad insulin and glucose spikes. So one more little side note here before we kind of wrap it all together, something called the personal fat threshold. If you haven't heard of this, it's the concept that when I actually heard this when I was like, I don't know, a teenager, and I just thought, oh, that was interesting, and then it came full circle a number of years ago when I started reading the science on this. But when you're a child, you make a lot of new fat cells, and you get to a certain age after, like when you're a toddler, and you kind of, your body, for whatever reason, and we don't fully understand why, doesn't really make a lot of new fat cells after that point. And you just fill up and empty the ones you have. And I don't know, you may have heard that. You just fill up your fat cells and empty them for the vast majority of people. And that means that we have people, through genetics, through early life, have very few fat cells on their body. This is that 110-pound person who can eat anything they want, and they don't gain weight, but they can still have diabetes. And we'll talk about why. And then you have other people who have a lot of fat cells on their body, and they can actually get pretty overweight before hitting insulin resistance and becoming have metabolic dysfunction. So fat cells can get overstuffed. So they're kind of like balloons, right? You can only fill them up so much before they burst. And so the fat cell, it'll get bigger and bigger, and when it gets to a point where it's like, okay, I've had enough, I can't take any more fat, I'm going to burst, I'm rejecting insulin. I'm becoming insulin resistant because I can't store any more fat in me, so I'm not going to take any more. And they become inflamed, and this is a source of all the majority of the metabolic problems that happen in the body when you get overweight. So as a lot of these fat cells in the body become stuffed, so a large percentage of the fat cells you have become stuffed, and they're like, I'm not taking any more fat. Well, guess what happens? Fat accumulates in places it shouldn't. It accumulates in the liver, and you get fatty liver. In the pancreas, it can your triglycerides shoot up, and you got real high triglycerides. This is insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. And key to this all, too, is when you start getting to that where all those fat cells, a lot of them are stuffed, that's when the fasting insulin really starts to go up. Because, again, the pancreas job is keep the fuel in the blood low. Triglycerides are shooting way up. So what's the pancreas going to do? Put out more insulin. Put out more insulin. Get that triglycerides down. But they're not going down because fat cells aren't taking it anymore. So you get this real high fasting insulin level. There's a lot of science behind this. You'll see here these charts are fat cells, and you see these are stuffed fat cells on this side, and these are smaller fat cells on this side. And in the liver, pancreas, white adipose tissue, your fat cells. And you'll see in all these cases, when they look at these cells, the smaller cells have reduced inflammation, reduced insulin resistance, reduced fibrosis. Everything about the small cell is healthy, and everything about the big fat cell is damaged and not healthy. So you want small fat cells. You don't want less fat cells. You just want them to be nice and small. So again, back to this example. When the fat cells are overstuffed, fasting insulin is going to rise very rapidly as you get to close to your personal fat threshold. And remember that fasting insulin is up to 80% of your daily insulin that your body uses in a day. So 80% of the insulin is fasting insulin, and it is rapidly going up as you get close to that personal fat threshold. So by far the biggest impact you're going to have on reversing insulin resistance is to deal with the fasting insulin, which means deal with those stuffed fat cells. Again, that's 20%, that's 80%. So as that fasting goes up, that's a way bigger impact on insulin and the body than any transients with food. So how do you measure if you're close to that personal fat threshold? There's something called adiponectin, which is something that the fat cells that are healthy and small put out adiponectin, and the stuffed ones don't put out as much. But as far as a test, and there's thousands of studies looking at adiponectin if you want to go crazy on that. And here's some of the examples. Everything they show on here is that when adiponectin's high, all this stuff gets better. Your liver function gets better. Everything's better when the adiponectin is high, meaning your fat cells are small. But as far as a test, it's a little hard because adiponectin can fluctuate through the day, and not a lot of doctors can know to test for that, and how to interpret it. Fasting insulin is a good proxy. So your fasting insulin level, that basal insulin, if you test that, that's a good proxy for if you're close. If it's 20 or 30, you're close to your fat threshold, and you better start shrinking those fat cells. So fasting insulin and fasting glucose tells you even a little bit more. Okay? So there's a calculation called HOMA-IR, which takes fasting insulin and fasting glucose and gives you a number, and it gives you kind of a gauge of your insulin resistance level. It is less than 1 means you're very insulin sensitive. Above 1.9, you're starting to get insulin resistant, and above 2.9, you're very insulin resistant. So if you take those two numbers, you can do there's calculators online too for this. So this is how you can kind of tell your insulin resistant level, if you will. And what is this like? Well, back to a car analogy here. Glucose, let's say glucose is the speedometer, and insulin is the tachometer, okay? So let's say your glucose is 85 milligrams per deciliter. 40 miles an hour, you're cruising. No problems, right? But insulin is 20. Fasting insulin is 20, okay? Pancreas, or your tachometer, your engine's pegged in the red line, keeping you at 40 miles an hour. That's not good, right? Same thing with insulin. Your pancreas is cranking out the insulin just to try to control that blood glucose and keep it at 85. And this is why this is so much better than just looking at fasting glucose. You look at fasting glucose for this person and be like, oh, 85, that's good, you're good, right? No, their pancreas is going nuts. Here's another example. What if it's a little higher, like your fasting's 105? Some people might be like, ooh, that's a little high, right? But the same person, they're idling. Their pancreas, their fasting insulin's at 2, which means it has no problem keeping things under control. And again, back to the HOMA-IR, for this person it's 4.2, very insulin resistant, even though fasting glucose is 85. This person, 0.5, very insulin sensitive. So one little case study I'm going to go on a sidetrack here for to hammer home this point on HOMA-IR, but also explain personal fat threshold even further. And a lot of times what people do, like researchers, what they'll do is like a gene knockout. So they'll take a mouse, and if they think this gene is responsible for whatever, they'll knock that gene out of that mouse and then see if these things that they're theorizing on just go crazy. Well, obviously that was connected, that was responsible, right? So this is kind of the opposite. So I said earlier that the vast majority of people do not make new fat cells as we get past being a toddler. Some of us can. There's genetically people out there who can continue to make new fat cells. So this is Tyler. He came to us. He actually went to high school with my wife, Maria. He was 645 pounds when he came to us. 575 was when we did these tests. And unlike most people, even though he's 38 years old, he can make new fat cells. So what should his labs look like? If not knowing about his fat cells, being able to create new ones, if you saw this person, what would you think? What do you think his insulin levels are going to be? What do you think his glucose levels are going to be? What do you A1C, triglycerides, probably through the roof, right? Yeah. What's that?
I think they'd be good because he makes more fat.
Well, I said, if you didn't know that, right? I should have had that on the next slide, maybe. Here's his labs. His fasting glucose is 50, which is kind of an odd low. Normally he's like 85 or 90. His fasting insulin is 3.51. His triglycerides, 77. HDL, 42. A1C, 5.6, not too bad. HOMA-IR for him is 0.4. He is And this just shows the power of personal fat threshold, right? Because if you can continue to make new fat cells, you'll never get insulin resistant. I don't think he ever would. Now, on one other note, I said, what'd you eat? What was your last meal before your 13-hour fast before this test? And he's like, well, it was Easter, not good. I had, last meal was cookies and cookies and cream ice cream with Oreos crushed on top. And his labs look like this 13 hours later. Now, I will add, this doesn't mean healthy at any size, okay? And to that respect, he's working hard to lose weight. You know, there's pressures on the heart and the joints, and you look across the board, losing weight is going to be an improvement for your health. And so this doesn't mean healthy at any size, but it shows the power of personal fat threshold to regulate whether you get insulin resistant or not. And this is, again, why somebody like him, you keep making new fat cells, insulin never rises. And again, if insulin's the problem, like elevated insulin makes you fat, what's happening here? He's got really low insulin. And then on the contrary to that, we've had women that come to us that are 105 pounds and type 2 diabetic. They're insulin resistant because they have very few fat cells and they get stuffed very quickly. And this one woman that was 105 pounds, she actually, we're kind of a vain society, right? She didn't see the weight gain on her body, so she just kept eating all the junk. And she actually burned her pancreas out. She's what they call type 1.5. She couldn't make insulin anymore either. So less excess body fat means more health regardless of your insulin resistance state. So, but again, happy fat cells are small fat cells. This can be a lot of fat cells or very few fat cells, depending on your genetics and what your fat threshold is. But you want them small. Metabolically, to be more flexible, the smaller your fat cells are, you can gain some weight before all this dysfunction starts to happen. So you get a little bit of flexibility there if you stay below that threshold. And another note, liposuction, guess what? You're sucking out fat cells. Now you're lowering your personal fat threshold. And so you can actually get insulin resistant quicker. And that's also, liposuction gives an example that you don't make a lot of new fat cells typically genetically because you pull it out of the area, it doesn't make new ones. You just end up storing it somewhere else where you do have fat cells. So small fat cells are happy fat cells. Tons of science on this. Going back to, I think, 1965 was the earliest paper on this that but here's a bunch of examples. I think I go a little quicker here, sorry. Dietary fat, there's only 3 pathways, right? You can either go in through your digestion and go to the muscles and be burned as fuel. It can either, option 2 is to go in your fat cells and get dumped and stored in your fat cells, or go right through you, right? Those are 3 ways that fat can go when you eat it. It can be used in cellular walls like DHA and cell walls and those kind of things, but that's microscopic amounts compared to these other pathways. So let's look at that. So studies show, does it go through the colon? Does it go right through you when you eat lots of fat? This study varied dietary fat from 62 grams a day to 152, and they tested the fecal output, and there was only 1.1 to 3.1 grams of fat in the stool. So for an extra 90 grams of fat in the diet, only an extra 1.9 grams ended up in the stool. It's not shooting right through you. And if it did, it would be a problem. If you remember the Wow chips, cholesterol was this fat that did go right through you, and they had to put a warning label on it. It could cause anal leakage, and that is just with an extra 10 or whatever grams of fat going through the GI tract. You don't want this happening. If it does, you'll know it, and it'll be very, very uncomfortable. Tiny amount goes through the colon, 1 to 3 grams. A little bit can go and burn in the muscle, but the vast majority that you eat goes into your fat stores. So what happens when we eat? Again, 80 calories in your entire blood volume when you're sitting here. That's all the pancreas wants. You eat a big meal, it's got to prioritize those fuels and start storing things away. So if carbs and fat are both elevated, Randall's cycle says we're going to burn the carbs more than the fat. So once you're back into this tight control of the fuel in the blood, then the pancreas will say, okay, it's regulating lipolysis. It's going to let a little more lipolysis start happening because we've controlled everything that came in the diet. So fat flux is this constant cycle of fat in and out of the fat cells. What happens is you got a triglyceride molecule, which is 3 free fatty acids. That's these right here. And then a glycerol molecule links them together, and that's how it's stored in your fat cells. It cleaves off the glycerol, takes those free fatty acids, and that's what you burn in your muscle. And those free fatty acids, people think that when you're keto, you're burning mostly ketones. You're actually burning mostly free fatty acids directly. The fat is directly burned in your muscles. And then some of the glycerol, if you burn some of that fat, can go into the liver, and 3 glycerol molecules make a glucose molecule. So you're actually getting some glucose when you burn fat. Because there's parts of the body that still need glucose. Red blood cells can only run on glucose, and some of the brain neurons. So fat flux, again, how do you control this? You want a little bit less coming in the diet so that as you burn more in the muscles, your fat cells start to shrink. If you overdo it in the diet, you're going to be slowing down this process because that dietary fat does end up in your fat cells. So you want to not overdo the fat. So a little bit on this too, and I don't know how I got so far behind here, but I'll skip ahead quickly. It depends a little bit on your state too. Like a tube of toothpaste that's full, you can get a lot out quickly and probably more than you want. When it's empty, it's hard to get it out, and that's kind of like your fat cells. When you get lower in body fat, you're going to need more in the diet because it's harder to get the fuel off the body too in a rapid manner. So why prioritize protein? Thermic effect of food. This is basically how much energy is needed to consume this food, right? So protein is highest. 25 to 30% of the calories from the protein are required to just consume it. And so you're basically increasing your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, and you get a metabolic benefit from that. Micronutrients. I did this 6 years ago here at KetoCon, and I said, what's got the most vitamins and minerals? The kale, the blueberries, or the steak? And most people be like, probably the kale. And it's not. It's the steak. You can see here, red meat, or beef in this case. Beef blows the rest of them out of the water for vitamins and minerals. What about fat? Fat doesn't have much. It's basically a fuel, right? Again, the same chart, eggs and beef sirloin, blow it out of the water. MCT oil actually has like nothing. It's just pure energy. Table sugar has a little more than MCT oil. I'm not comparing these two like they're equal or anything, but for vitamins and minerals, it's not great. And look how much a beef sirloin for 400, this is all 400 calories. It's only, 3 tablespoons of MCT oil is the same as 11 ounces of beef sirloin. I know which one's going to keep me full longer. So skip the butter coffees. Just stick with the fat that comes with your steak or your meat and that kind of thing. It also helps with vitality. So your bones are basically a matrix of protein filled in with calcium. And so as we age, we also have a leucine curve shift. Leucine is the amino acid responsible for building muscle primarily. And that shifts with age. So you need even more protein as you get older just to maintain your muscle. And you need lots of protein to maintain your bone health as well. The leading cause of death in elderly is falls. So that's 2 great ways to prevent that. So at the end of the day, how do we reverse insulin resistance? We grow our muscle, or at least maintain our muscle. If you grow it, you give glucose more places to go. So glucose is stored in the muscle. The more muscle you have, the more places you got to shove off glucose and get rid of it out of the bloodstream. Prioritizing protein and strength training will get you that. And then you want to shrink your fat cells. You want to get below your fat threshold. You want to make the fat cells smaller and happier. How do you do that? You get into a negative fat flux, meaning you burn more fat out of your fat cells than you put back in. And the back in comes from primarily the diet. Again, the goal is not to eliminate spikes with food necessarily, other than driving hunger, like we talked with the standard American diet. It's really to bring down that fasting basal insulin level. That's going to be a way bigger impact on the overall insulin output for the day Again, in a low-carb context, that's 80% of your insulin is the basal or fasting insulin. So that should be the biggest goal. I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to buzz through these. We can get the slides, but here's some examples of what this can do. These are all medications. I went through we get thousands of testimonies over the last 20 years of doing this, and these are just some of the medications people got off of. This person went from 13 pills a day to none, and her Parkinson's is arrested, and all her labs are normal, just with diet. Lots of medications. Here's a bunch of examples of people lowering their dietary fat and seeing huge improvements in the results. It doesn't mean low fat and doesn't mean no fat. It just means don't eat the butter coffee. Don't put a stick of butter on your steak if you're trying to lose weight. And then it can become dangerous, and this is where personal fat threshold comes in. If somebody's at their personal fat threshold and they start eating a keto diet or carnivore diet with sticks of butter on top, it can make it worse. And this person here, I'll read this real quick. High-fat carnivore for 7 to 8 years, type 2 diabetic, became essentially type 1, started burning out the beta cells, even on carnivore. Stopped high fat a year ago, blood sugars were slashed in half, etc. So this is the way to go. Here's a crazy example. This was psoriasis. She was on 3K a month medication that did little. All she did was change her diet, add some emu oil that we told her to take, and in 3 weeks, she went from there to there. 3 weeks. And that's it. We've got a couple things, macros. We got lots of free resources out there. So, thank you.